G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza and this video is a tutorial on how to use light and shade in your illustrations and paintings. The subject of this tutorial was voted on by you guys, and you can vote on my next tutorial and all of my future tutorials by checking out the link on the screen and in the description. So go check that out and vote now. The poll is always updated, so whenever you go to that page it has the current list of options for upcoming tutorials. And as usual, anyone who is interested to follow this in more detail, the reference file for this tutorial is freely available, which you can check out by clicking the link in the description, and that includes this Photoshop files with all the layers and everything that I'm going to make in this tutorial as well. So in getting started, this is a little example I've prepared earlier, but it's an example of something pretty standard. It's an example of where you might be or where you might start off, but what we're going to talk about is how to take something like this sort of shading and explain how I've done this shading and take it to the next level. Use those techniques and add dimension and extremity and drama to your light and shade. So as you can see, what I've got here is a pretty standard looking sort of figure. I'm sure you've seen this sort of shading quite often. What is actually happening in terms of the light and shade is we have the most prominent, closer aspects of this feature, the things that are popping out like the ridges of the cheeks and the eyebrows and the forehead and the nose are all a bit lighter than other areas of the face, like the back of the head or the inner parts of the eyes, under the nose, under the lip, all those little nooks and crannies that are covered by shadow or that the light doesn't hit. Now to further demonstrate this, I'm just going to draw some scribbly lines all over the face. The more prominent features of the face, like I mentioned, the things popping out are the eyebrows, the nose and the tip of the nose, and then we have the cheekbones or the ridges of the cheeks here. And then to a lesser extent, we sort of have this side area of the face and then sort of the top area on top of the lips, not the top lip itself, but just sort of this upper area here. But then we have the bottom lip, which catches more light than the top lip. And we have the chin, the forehead, and the front part of the neck. So these are my scribbly lines, and you can see that just where I've drawn the scribbly lines, it complements the shading that I've done. But even if I hide the shading that I've done, you can see just on my raw base shade that they are the areas that would stick out more prominently. And then of course, by extension, we can find in opposite land the areas of the face most sunken and distant from the viewer. So we have things like the inner areas of the eyes. And then we also have these lines that go between the nose and the mouth. I always make sure to do these very subtly, because if you do it too strong, they can look old. They're kind of something that you can accentuate to make someone look older. So if you use stronger lines or shading in that area, it can make someone look a little too old if you don't intend them to. There are also these little areas on the sides of the mouth where when the mouth ends, it kind of pushes up against the skin, and that's where like we get this little shadow just on the sides there. They're not dimples, which are on the outside here if people have them, but they're just on the very inner corners, the edges of the mouth, and that just kind of helps add dimension. And then of course we have the outer edge of the face. So I won't go over the whole outer edge of the face, but you get the idea. It's the more distant part of the head that goes kind of all around the head, and of course inside the ear, under the nose, and under the lip. So it's all pretty self-explanatory. Now, why am I going over all this detail? Well, it's quite simply because the light and shadow that have been used in this example here, they just kind of mirror them and match them. And while we do get something that in the end looks pretty straightforward, but it also has some format, has some dimension, it looks pretty three-dimensional. The problem is when you take a simple shape, for example, like a circle here, and you apply the same method of shading, you get something that looks pretty stale. And that's why this is a bit of a problem. Because even though to an extent it can communicate dimension and make something look a little more three-dimensional, the light source in essence is front and center. It's at the dead center of the thing that you're drawing, and it's uninteresting. It feels, in reality, though it adds a bit of dimension, it still feels flat and it doesn't make your image pop out anymore. So what I'm going to do in this video is talk about 3 little steps and techniques I keep in mind to, when working with light and shade, make things really pop out, make things have much more of a dimension and snap to them and drama. The first step is the direction of the main source of lighting. Front and center is uninteresting. The other 2 steps are solid shadows and strong highlights. Now we're going to get to that in detail later, but for now, suffice it to say that this image has no strong highlights and no solid shadows. It's just kind of a soft shadow, soft highlight, and we get something that's sort of substandard but looks reasonable. So first things first, in making a new and more interesting look with the shadows and highlights, I'm going to duplicate my folder. And I've gotten rid of my shadow and highlight layer. It's of course in the original one. This is a duplicate, so it doesn't matter that I've deleted them. But I'm going to move my light source up and a little bit to the right. And we're going to use this as the sort of direction of the core light source to add our shadow and highlights. Now I still have my surface map that I've sort of scribbled up here, and I can use that in a moment. But the other thing that I have ready on the side is a little palette. So I've got that now revealed over here, and basically what I have is my base tone, which is colored in total now. And the previous shading that I used, the darkest areas when solid and as dark as they could get, were here at its darkest, and then here at its lightest. So we have my shadow and my highlights. Now the reason I have this off to the side, I have my little palette, is so that while I'm painting, I can jump back to my base palette colors and just eyedrop them and then go back to my brush and put them in. And I'll show you how I'm actually going to do that. First off, I'm going to select the brush that I want to use, and I have a whole bunch of different custom brushes by Kyle T. Webster, and the reason I use them is because I really like them. They tend to look quite fun and organic, and they're really easy to use. And now with the brush that I want selected, if I hold Alt and then let go, you can see that it transitions between the brush and an eyedropper. So what that enables me to do is hold Alt and click on my shadow palette, and it just selects that color, and then I can let go, and then I can paint with that color. I can go back to my base tone and back to my shadow, to my highlight, and all I'm doing is Alt click, paint, Alt click, paint. Okay, with my brush tool, I'm just going to paint, and I'm pressing a little harder here, but then I can sort of gently loosen my brush strokes as I go around here, then enlarge the brush and soften the strokes. And as you can see, I'm starting to get a little bit of a gradient look. Now the problem is it's not very smooth, because you can see that I have this sort of strokey look. Now blending is where I can Alt click one of these mid-tone colors between my shadow and core mid-tone, say in here, and then I've selected that, and then I can sort of just paint in that middle area with that mid-tone color, and it sort of softens it even more. Then I can go back to my mid-tone and spread it out. The blending is quite simply selecting the mid-tones between each color that you paint between each other, and just kind of pushing things out, smoothing things out, and you get a much more softer, much more smooth gradiented look. So I can now go across, grab my highlight by Alt clicking, go back to my little ball example here and paint in my ball highlight, and then maybe paint a little bit more of a highlight area emanating around that until I'm happy with my result. And you can see that if I zoom out here and show my light source, it's following that same sort of light source. I'm going to create a duplicate because the one on the ball should be in the same sort of position in respect to where the head one is. And you can see that, yes, the light source is sort of at the front, up, and a little bit to the right. And quite quickly, I was able to paint the shadows and highlights with my little brush tool here, just by adding the shadows and blending that with the original color, and then adding the highlights and blending that as well. So that's basically the core technique of how I do the painting on a figure like this. And I'm going to do that now in practice, but this is going to take a little more calculation, because the surface of this head has lots of outy bits and inny bits. And I'm going to use my surface map at first as a bit of a guide on how to add the shadows and highlights. Now I'm going to make my surface map a little lighter so it's not too intrusive. And for those of you who are wondering how I'm painting all of this inside the lines without going out of these color areas, this core color, the base tone that I've painted here, is a clipping mask. So basically what that means, if I have my shadow area and paint here, it means I can't go over the edges, even though I'm painting over the edge here right now. But that's because I have a new layer here in my Photoshop file on top of that core layer, which I Alt clicked to create the clipping mask. And I can Alt click on that line between them again to remove it. And you can see that it still has all that stuff I painted. So when I Alt click again, it just plonks it inside the original painted area that I had. So I can delete that now. It doesn't matter to me anymore. I'm going to actually do the painting. And now I'm going to use my simple surface map guide to know where to place my base shadows. Now, the most important thing to keep in mind when figuring out where shadow goes is to keep in mind that shadow is quite simply the absence of light. So what we need to do is see where our light source is in respect to where the ridges that pop out most are, and then by extension we can deduce that shadow won't hit the area behind here because light is coming down, and this ridge would be blocking behind here. Furthermore, we have this side of the head here because this ridge here will be blocking light from going under here. And on this side of the head, it's a little different because light will be hitting this side of the cheek more than it will be over here. So there's actually going to be more shadow on this side here, but less shadow on this side of the ridge of the nose as well. Now the light is quite high, so I can add all the shadow under the eyebrows of both eyes. And you'll notice I'm being quite rough with my placement of this shadow color, and that's okay. In fact, that's quite useful. It means I can just splash down all the most bold shadow areas. So for example, here under the chin, there's going to be quite a lot of shadow because the light is going to be casting it here. And you'll notice that I've got a bit of an angle to the shadow, that there's more shadow on this side than there is this side because the light is moved a little bit to the right. So we want to oppose that cast by placing it in that sort of direction. So we do the same thing with the nose. We don't necessarily just have it go straight down. We have it move a little bit to the left because the light that is being cast down in this direction is blocked from getting to this bottom left area by this large ridge, this nose ridge. So you'll notice the ear on the left is almost completely covered in shadow. There's just this little bit on the tip there with light on it, whereas the ear on the right has much more light on the ridge of the surface area of that ear. So I'm pretty happy with how that's placed down. I've got a pretty basic idea of how the shadows are kind of falling. And if I hide my surface map, it does look fairly organic. Now, it doesn't look perfect. It doesn't look very pretty by any means. But what this allows me now to do is alt-click and select one of these mid-tone colors between my base mid-tone and the shadow, and to start pushing the shadow around and evening the shading quite a bit. And it's one of those processes that may be a little tricky to get used to at first, but once you're used to it, it can actually be quite quick to produce. So now I'm happy with how I've roughly sort of spread out those shadow tones, and now I can alt-click and select my highlight tone, and I generally like to do this on a separate layer so that if I make any mistakes, I can erase just the highlight tones without messing up the shadow tones that I've placed down that I'm happy with. So on a layer above my shadow tones, alt-clicking my little highlight tone there, and keeping in mind where my light source is, I can sort of add little highlight sections like this, and I just like to roughly place down a few little areas like this, just to sort of indicate where the most prominent areas of highlights are. And then I enlarge my brush a bit and very softly kind of branch out those highlight areas. And just like the shadows, every time they're too strong, you can bring them back by alt-clicking and blending back with the original colors. Now, as you can see, that wasn't incredibly difficult to produce. If you have a basic understanding of geometry, of how shapes have their ridges, and particularly organic shapes like faces and hands and torsos and stuff, when they have their ridges and inset areas, if you can sort of move the light and outline the shadow areas that are going to be blocked from where that light source is, and just make sure that the light is in more of an interesting position than front and center, you can get more interesting looks. And you can see that just jumping between these two painted figures, the original and the one I've just created. The one I've just created does tend to feel a little more three-dimensional. The first one, the front and center lighting, feels almost like the lighting that you have in default 3D programs. When you're modeling the geometry of 3D models, that is the lighting that they use. The light emanates from exactly where the camera is, which is where we are viewing from, our perception point. So in shading like this, we get that sort of generic, unrendered, not very pretty look. But then when we move the light around a bit, all of a sudden it feels a little bit more in depth. But this is just scratching the surface, because you can make it look even cooler. You can make things really feel solid and really pop out by adding some solid shadows and some strong highlights. So what I'm going to do is add to my color palette. I'm going to select my shadow, And in my color picker, I'm going to bring down my color picker to a much darker shade, and I'm going to paint under here and add a swatch to my palette. And I'm going to do the same with my highlights, selecting a lighter, almost white, but not quite white. Paint down and add that swatch to my palette. And you can see now I've got these two extra swatches. So this bottom swatch is going to be my hard shadow swatch, and this top one is going to be my strong highlight. Now, what are we going to do with this? What are we going to do with our hard shadow and our strong highlights? Well, not anything too different from what we've already done. The only difference is we're going to be a bit braver. So what we've actually got here already is a strong foundation. We've got a really good base area to start off with. Now, you could be happy with this as a final result, because once you have this as a result, it feels sort of satisfying, and it would be too scary for some sort of developing artists to go too boldly where they haven't been before. But it can be one of the most satisfying things and the best things you can do for an image. So I'm going to demonstrate what I mean on my trusty shading ball over here. I'm going to add a new layer inside the clipping mask of the ball, and with my oil paintbrush selected and my hard shadow selected, I'm going to quite conservatively paint a very dark shadow area in the very opposite area of where the light source is coming from. Now, the thing to keep in mind when using solid shadow areas is that they're solid. So we don't really necessarily want to do any blending, because we want them to have sharp edges. We want them to look like they start and end quite immediately. And it's also the sort of thing that we can add behind the ball. So what I might want to do is indicate really strong shading by painting this dark area here underneath the ball, a bit of a drop shadow, keeping in mind where my light source is, so I can use that as a bit of a guide. And I'm basically replicating this shape, but on the flattened surface of a plane, so it's not going to be very round. It's going to just kind of look like wherever the light is that it's being blocked by, we want to make sure that this shadow dwells. And quite simply like that, we've added our hard shadow area. Now the next step is to work with our solid highlight. So I'm going to Alt-click to select my white highlight, and I'll add a new layer to my clipping mask. And there are two things that we can do with this. The first is the most obvious thing, which is just kind of add a strong highlight area in the direction of where the light is coming from. This is most useful or prevalent on objects that are a little bit shiny or glossy. So if this ball is going to be a bit of a reflective looking ball or have that sort of shiny surface, having a very solid highlight in the direction of the light source is one of the most useful ways to convey that. But the other thing that I like to do personally is add another light source. And this light source would be painted directly behind the ball itself, like this. So we've got this little light source peeking out from behind. Now, why have two light sources? Well, it's interesting to keep in mind that in things like film and photography, there's always more than one light source. In fact, in the room that you're in, even though you may have one light on in the room, light bounces around the walls, light comes in from the windows, and using a source of lighting directly behind the object that you're painting or taking photos or video of can help separate it from the domain that it's in by adding what's called rim lighting or edge lighting. So what I mean by this is just similar to the shadow that I've painted. If I, in a very fine way, paint this strong highlight directly around the edges of this ball. And we don't want to be too overbearing with it. And remember, we want to keep in mind that the light source is directly behind the ball, but also a little bit to the left. So it's going to be stronger on the left side of the ball, closer to that light source. And though it is going to show slightly here on the right, it's going to be more faded. And I find it interesting and satisfying how immediately adding this backlight source really makes the image pop. Now, it's not always applicable to all scenarios, but it is in quite a lot, and it's one of the more powerful things that you can use in making your shading stand out, in making your figures stand out. So these are the two extra things, the two final tips applied, using solid shadow and using strong highlights, and adding that extra light source behind the object or even in another area of the object is a great way to do that. So now let's do the same thing with our figure here, including the light source directly behind and to the left of the figure. So I'll put that little light source over there. there, and I add another layer to my clipping mask for the shading area of the face, and alt-click to select my dark shadow area, and following the same system that I use to outline where the first shadows are, I can use this to put down my solid shadows, and this is going to add a lot of drama very quickly. And remember to use it fairly sparingly and as accurately as you can to outline the areas that are completely blocked by the sun. And sometimes it helps to actually do this by outline first. So I might outline the areas that the light source won't hit at all, and then just go back and color them in. Now I tend to find that the top lip being very dark is a good way to go, because the top lip is always on this sort of outwards angle that doesn't catch light very easily. Same thing with adding shadow underneath the bottom lip. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that asymmetry can be one of the most useful things to add interest to your piece. So for example, here with the ears, our left ear is almost completely covered in solid shadow, and our right ear has interesting areas where the highlight is hitting. Again, under the jaw, under the chin, is an area that is almost always cast in solid shadow when the light is above the head. And as for how immediately these solid shadow areas end, sometimes it's a more prominent start and finish line, for example under the eyebrows or in the ridges of the ears here. And sometimes, for example on the tip of the nose where it sort of bends under, it's not as immediate. We can have a fairly rapid but gradual gradient area. Another thing that happens is something called ambient occlusion, where there is a darker area simply in the more indented areas with a more gradiented look and a more solid shadow that we can sort of work with to make things pop out a bit more too. And now that I've got my solid shadow in, I'm ready to add my strong highlights. And again, like I did in my original highlight layer, I'm just going to add a little more accentuation in these little highlighted areas just by putting in a bit of my stronger highlight color. And I'm not going to do it like I did on the ball with just very strong solid highlight shapes. I'm just going to gently brush in some extra highlight in those areas with my highlight color, and then with a bigger brush sort of expand that out slightly, but not too broadly. These strong highlights are going to be a little more contained in the areas most poking out and in the direction of the light source. And then finally, one of my favorite little steps, wherever there is a strong rear light, a backing light, we can add some of these edge highlights. Now the interesting thing to keep in mind is we're doing like we did with the shadow, only adding the areas that the light is hitting. So for example, here we have this interesting ridge where there's a lot of very dark shadow right where this rear light source is strongest. So we add the rear light source fairly obviously where it connects to the light source, but wherever it would be blocked, wherever the light wouldn't get through. So for example, here between the ear and the cheekbone, there might be a very light sort of bouncing of that light source, but it would fade off pretty quickly because the ear would block it from hitting the head. The ear, however, would get a bit of a strong whack of that light source, and then of course here where it's no longer blocked by the light source, it can pick up some strength again. Same thing again here, the rear light source is blocked by the neck, so we can have it sort of fade out a little bit here, but then the neck sort of picks up the strength of that rear lighting. And remember, this rear light source doesn't always just sit on the edges. So for example, here we have some of this neck muscle sort of popping out here. That would sort of pick up the edge of that light source as well. And even areas like this side of the lip, the side of the nose here on the very edge. Keeping in mind, this is a completely separate light source to our main light source up the top. So we can actually add light fairly strong in some areas that we didn't originally have any indication of a light source coming from. the side of the nose being one of those areas, the ridge of this eyebrow perhaps on the left, and then because it's directly behind the entire object, we can very lightly pull it around, and we don't want to make it too overbearing on the other side. We don't want to make it a light outline around the whole thing, but we can just kind of add a few little areas where it will kind of reach the other side of the head. Once again, the most prominent areas of the rim lighting are going to be in this direction on the left of the head. So there you go. As you can see with my solid shadows and strong highlights, the difference is remarkable. In fact, if I just hide my strong highlights there, the difference there alone is remarkable. And if I hide my shadow as well, it almost makes it look like a completely different and much more flat and boring image. And that was also after we moved the lighting. So if we compare this, our image now with solid shadows and strong highlights with our original image, you can see that the difference in the shading, in the way we've used the light and shade is huge. It's phenomenal. This face, our original face, has that front and center, flat, boring, generic way of shading the face. Our new method adds a huge amount of dimension. We can see where the ridges are. We know where the light sources are. The lighting is interesting and dramatic. Oh, and of course there's one last thing I forgot. In terms of light sources, solid highlight, I actually forgot to add is one in the eyes. So what I would actually do is add a very strong highlight in the direction of this top right light source. And because there is a light source in the back left, I'm just going to add a little line here just to indicate that there may be reflections on objects on the front of the person that is catching that light, but it's not going to be as strong and solid as this front light source. And already you can see that that as well really makes the image pop out. So I hope this tutorial has been useful and that you found it interesting. There are a whole bunch of other tutorials on my YouTube channel on how to paint in Photoshop and how to use shade and light and things like that. And of course, animation and competitions and lots of other stuff. So make sure to check out my channel, subscribe, and support my stuff on my JAZZA'S Studios shop if you like my work and you want to get some more tutorial resources to help you develop your skills. Thanks for watching, ladies and gentlemen, and until next time, I'll see you later. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel to see new content every week. Check out more of my stuff by clicking the annotations over there. If you want to support my work and get a few goodies for yourself, head over to my store for archives, ebooks, and get yourself something nice. If you're looking for a great place to collaborate, explore, or share your own content, head over to newgrounds.com. That's it for now, and until next time, see you later.